Haley Brooks walked into the civilian shooting range, her entrance unnoticed by most of the people present. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, just an old pair of jeans and a simple shirt. Her movements were purposeful but calm, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the range. The other shooters, mainly young SEAL trainees, didn't give her a second glance. They were too wrapped up in their own banter, their loud voices dominating the space. As she made her way to an open lane, a few of the trainees exchanged looks, their eyes narrowing at the sight of her. They couldn't help but make assumptions about her. One of them, a cocky young man with a broad grin, leaned over to his buddy and whispered, "Bet she can't even handle the recoil." Laughter followed, a mocking sound that filled the air. But Haley didn't seem to notice. She kept her focus, unbothered by the comments floating around her. The group of trainees continued with their mockery, turning their attention back to their own targets, fully convinced that this woman couldn't possibly measure up. Another voice rang out. "Hey, you might want to start with the closer targets," a different SEAL trainee suggested, loud enough for everyone to hear. His tone was condescending, as if Haley had no business attempting a shot at anything farther away. More laughter echoed through the room. But still, Haley didn't respond. She simply nodded politely, her movements unhurried, as though she hadn't heard them at all. This group of young men had seen it all. They were part of elite military training, accustomed to the highest levels of discipline and marksmanship. They weren't used to seeing anyone in a civilian setting who could challenge their skills, let alone a woman dressed so casually. To them, Haley was just another civilian who probably had no experience with firearms, beyond what she'd seen in a weekend shooting class. Their judgment, though, couldn't have been more off. What they didn't realize was that Haley was far more than she appeared. She wasn't there for a recreational shoot. She wasn't looking to impress anyone or prove a point. She was simply going through the motions, setting up her gear with a quiet intensity that only a trained professional would have. Her rifle was stored in a simple, worn canvas bag. She carefully laid out each component, cleaning the barrel and adjusting the stock with the precision of someone who had spent years training in high-pressure environments. The difference between her quiet demeanor and the bold arrogance of the trainees couldn't have been more obvious. The mockery continued. One of the trainees, more sure of himself than the others, decided to make a show of it. "You sure you know how to handle that thing?" he called out with a grin. His buddies snickered in the background, enjoying the moment. But Haley didn't react. She didn't need to explain herself or offer a witty retort. Instead, she continued with her preparation, methodically assembling her rifle. The young man's words had no impact on her. It was as if she was in a different world, focused only on the task at hand. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. While the SEAL trainees were basking in their confidence, Haley was a silent force of nature. Her actions spoke louder than their jokes, but they had yet to realize it. As she finished setting up, she adjusted her stance, her eyes focused on the target ahead. Her calmness in the face of mockery wasn't weakness. It was strength, the kind that didn't need to be proclaimed. It was the kind of strength that didn't require validation. The young SEALs were too wrapped up in their own self-assurance to notice the depth of Haley's experience. She wasn't fazed by their attempts to provoke her, and that in itself was something they couldn't comprehend. They were trained to expect a reaction, especially from someone who didn't look the part. But Haley wasn't the type to fall into their trap. She simply stood there, allowing them to underestimate her, knowing that she didn't need to prove anything to them. She didn't care for their approval. She wasn't there to show off or engage in a battle of egos. Their jokes, their laughter, the sneers, it all bounced off her like water off a duck's back. To them, she was just another civilian. To her, they were simply an audience. But as she prepared for the first shot, one thing was certain the moment they least expected it. The stage would be set for her to show them exactly who she was. For now, she remained silent. Her quiet determination was her weapon, and with every second that ticked by, the anticipation in the air grew heavier. The trainees hadn't realized it yet, but they were about to be stunned. The range, with its sounds of casual conversation and loud laughter, was on the verge of witnessing something extraordinary. All it would take was one shot, one moment, for everything to change. And as Haley took her place at the firing lane, she didn't let their mockery bother her. She was there for one reason only, to do what she had done countless times before. But unlike them, she didn't need to boast or draw attention to herself. She simply needed to perform. And when the time came, her silence would speak volumes. Haley reached into the worn canvas bag that had seen better days, pulling out the components of her rifle one by one. Each piece was handled with care, as if it were a delicate instrument that demanded the utmost precision. The bag was old and faded, bearing the marks of countless missions and years of use in far more challenging environments than this civilian shooting range. There was nothing flashy about her equipment, but everything was functional and in perfect condition. As she removed the pieces, she laid them out on the table in front of her, her movements calm and deliberate, each action purposeful. The other shooters around her, particularly the young SEAL trainees, were busy with their own preparations, their chatter loud and filled with bravado. They were comparing gear, laughing at each other's new accessories, and showing off their latest toys. To them, the civilian range was a place to practice, to enjoy their shooting skills in a laid-back environment, without the weight of real-world pressure. They didn't see anything special about Haley. She wasn't carrying a flashy gun case or an expensive, custom rifle. In fact, her rifle seemed almost out of place among the pristine, high-end models surrounding it. But that was part of Haley's strategy to blend in, to be underestimated. Haley's hands worked with fluidity as she began to assemble the rifle. Each piece was placed in its proper position, each movement calculated and precise, the kind of precision that could only come from years of training. The SEALs, still caught up in their banter, didn't notice her at first. To them, she was just another woman at the range, one of the many people they considered amateurs. They assumed she had no idea what she was doing, her casual attire and old bag convincing them she was nothing more than a hobbyist. As she slid the barrel into place, there was no sign of hesitation or uncertainty. Her fingers worked with the ease of someone who had disassembled and reassembled rifles countless times, in situations where the pressure to perform was high. The smoothness of her movements contrasted sharply with the rough, brash energy of the trainees around her. They were laughing, discussing what they would do next, and making jokes at her expense. But Haley was undisturbed. She remained focused, her attention on the task at hand. The sound of the trainees' voices blended into the background as she tightened the screws, adjusted the stock, and checked the sights. They were still making fun of her, but she didn't flinch. One of them looked over, offering a sarcastic suggestion. "You might want to try some lighter targets," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You know, ones that don't move." His friends laughed, but Haley didn't acknowledge them. She simply tightened the last screw and gave the rifle a quick once-over, ensuring everything was in perfect condition. She stood back for a moment, assessing the setup with a practiced eye. There was a calm about her, an aura of quiet confidence that no one in the range seemed to recognize. Her stance was relaxed, yet every movement was steeped in the knowledge that she could handle anything. The range threw her way. The other shooters were still oblivious to the fact that they were in the presence of someone who had spent years in far more dangerous situations than this. They had no idea that she was not just another shooter with a simple rifle, but a trained professional who had performed under fire. With the rifle now fully assembled, Haley began the process of loading the magazine. She took her time, carefully ensuring each round was placed in its chamber with deliberate precision. The magazine clicked into place with a soft snap. The sound was drowned out by the laughter and chatter around her, but to anyone who understood the weight of each action, the silence between her movements spoke volumes. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the other shooters, who were still discussing strategies for improving their aim. None of them noticed Haley's quiet, methodical preparation. One of the SEALs, a younger man with a swagger that was more confidence than substance, walked past Haley's lane. He didn't even glance at her equipment. "You sure you can handle that recoil?" he said, his voice loud enough for her to hear. "Those rifles can be pretty unforgiving if you're not used to them." He had no idea who he was talking to. The words were intended to provoke a reaction, but Haley didn't rise to the bait. She simply adjusted her position and looked down the range, her eyes focusing on the target ahead of her. As she prepared to fire, the room around her filled with the sound of other shooters discussing techniques, comparing notes, and bragging about their skills. It was clear they considered themselves the experts in the room. They were enjoying the camaraderie of their shared experience, each one convinced of their superiority. But Haley wasn't there for their approval. She wasn't concerned with their egos or their opinions of her abilities. She had been in situations where showing off wasn't an option, where survival depended on the kind of discipline she was now demonstrating in. This range, her focus was singular. Her mind zeroed in on the target. The other shooters still saw her as a civilian, as someone who was simply playing at shooting. They didn't know that Haley's training had been honed in environments far more dangerous than a simple range. They didn't realize that the techniques she was preparing to use were the result of years of operational experience, where every shot had consequences, where every movement counted. They couldn't know that the precision she was about to demonstrate had been perfected under far more intense conditions than the ones they faced in their Daily training? As the seconds ticked by, the contrast between Haley's quiet professionalism and the SEAL trainees' casual bravado grew ever more apparent. They continued to talk and laugh, still unaware of the real danger in underestimating her. Haley's movements were slow but deliberate, each one showcasing the kind of skill that had been developed through years of high-stakes training. She was not there to impress anyone. She didn't need to. The rifle was an extension of her body, a tool she knew better than anything else. Finally, she was ready. With one last glance downrange, Haley set her sights on the target. The noise from the other shooters seemed to fade away, leaving only the steady rhythm of her breathing and the calm in her mind. She was prepared, and nothing in the world could disrupt that focus. She wasn't just a woman at a civilian shooting range. She was a professional, and her time to demonstrate that would come soon. But for now, the SEAL trainees remained oblivious, their laughter and chatter continuing unabated. Haley didn't mind. She wasn't there for them. She was there to show them something they would never forget. As Haley settled into position, adjusting her stance, the group of SEAL trainees couldn't help but notice her again. One of the younger ones, a cocky, eager to impress figure, approached her lane with a smirk. He had been watching her silently, still unsure of what to make of her calm, unassuming presence. It didn't take long before he decided to make his move. "You might want to start with the closer targets," he said, leaning in with that self-assured tone of someone who thought they knew better. "Those long-range ones are pretty tough, even for people who actually know what they're doing." His voice rang out loud enough for the entire range to hear, drawing the attention of the others who had started to chuckle at his suggestion. Haley didn't look up. She didn't even acknowledge him directly. Instead, she simply continued adjusting her rifle, the quiet sound of metal against metal and the soft click of the action, blending with the background noise of the range. The young SEAL trainee, convinced of his own superiority, stood with his hands on his hips, watching her every move with an air of casual authority. He wasn't even trying to hide his amusement now. "I mean, these rifles can pack a punch," he added, louder this time, just in case someone missed it. "Not sure you're ready for that kind of recoil." His friends snickered. The atmosphere around them was light, almost playful, but for Haley, it was just another day. Haley's eyes remained focused, her attention unwavering. She had heard this kind of talk countless times before, from people who had no idea what she was capable of. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. She didn't feel the need to respond. There was no point in arguing or explaining herself. Her actions would speak for her, as they always had. The young man was still standing there, waiting for a reaction, as if expecting Haley to challenge him or offer some witty retort. But she didn't. She simply raised her rifle to her shoulder, her movements smooth and deliberate, as if this were just another routine practice. The contrast between the cocky SEALs and her calm focus could not have been starker. The noise from the other shooters around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet clicking of the rifle's bolt and the steady rhythm of Haley's breathing. Haley set her aim, her gaze fixed on the distant target. She didn't rush. There was no need to. She took a deep breath, her finger hovering gently over the trigger. The trainees, still watching, were likely expecting her to struggle, maybe flinch when she pulled the trigger. After all, they were convinced this kind of precision was beyond someone like her. But Haley was used to pressure. She had faced situations where failure was not an option, where her life and the lives of others depended on perfect execution. This was nothing compared to that. She squeezed the trigger gently, and the sound of the shot echoed across the range. It wasn't a single sharp crack, but a crisp, controlled sound, almost drowned out by the noise of the other shooters. But something was different. The young SEAL trainee, still standing in Haley's line of sight, watched as the bullet hit the target. His smirk faded when he saw the first hole punch the center of the bullseye. The second shot rang out almost immediately, followed by a third, a fourth, and a fifth. Each bullet hit its mark with surgical precision, the rounds landing in a tight cluster at the center of the target. The group of trainees fell silent as the final shot rang out. The sequence had been flawless. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits, each one forming a nearly perfect pattern in the bullseye. The sound of Haley's shots was like a cold slap in the face to the young SEAL trainee who had been so eager to belittle her. His eyes widened in disbelief, his mouth going dry. Around him, the others stared at the target, their earlier confidence now replaced with shock and awe. One of the other shooters, who had been casually chatting before, stopped mid-sentence as the magnitude of what he was witnessing sank in. "No way," he muttered under his breath. The murmurs started to spread across the range. People began to gather around the target, their voices filled with amazement as they examined the holes. Some were whispering to each other, incredulous at what they had just seen. "That's perfect," someone said, their voice almost a reverent hush. The young SEAL trainee who had mocked her earlier stood frozen, his face slack with disbelief. He stared at the target, his bravado completely evaporated. It wasn't just that she had made the shot, it was how she had done it. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, just a smooth, almost effortless display of skill. It was clear now that Haley wasn't just some novice shooter. She was a marksman of an entirely different caliber. Haley didn't look up. She didn't need to. She had done what she came to do. Her rifle was still raised, her body relaxed but poised, her gaze fixed on the target. To her, this was just another part of the routine. The SEALs, though, were beginning to realize that they had misjudged her completely. The young trainee, still standing there, now had a look of dawning realization. The disrespect he had shown moments before was gone, replaced by something he hadn't expected: respect. Haley carefully lowered her rifle and ejected the magazine. The action smooth and fluid, as if the whole thing had been effortless. She didn't need to say a word. Her actions had spoken louder than anything she could have said. The air around her was heavy now, the previously casual atmosphere suddenly charged with the understanding that they were in the presence of someone whose skill far exceeded their own. As the trainees slowly began to process what had just happened, the silence lingered in the air. It wasn't just awe, it was the kind of respect that comes only after someone has proven their worth in a way that leaves no room for doubt. Haley's shot had been the ultimate response to their mockery, and it was a lesson they would not soon forget. It was clear now that Haley was no amateur, and whatever assumptions they had about her were shattered in the time it took for 5 perfect shots to find their mark. The sound of the rifle's last shot seemed to echo in the range long after it had ended, the moment of disbelief hanging in the air, as the young SEAL trainee slowly realized he had underestimated the quiet woman who had just shown him the meaning of true precision. As Haley continued her practice, her precision was impossible to ignore. The young SEAL trainees, still in the midst of their laughter and casual chatter, began to pay closer attention. With every shot, Haley's movements grew more fluid, her technique more refined. The group, still too proud to admit it, couldn't help but notice the subtle elegance with which she handled the rifle. The shots weren't just accurate, they were expertly timed and controlled, hitting the target with a consistency that only came from years of experience in the most demanding conditions. It was clear now that she was no ordinary shooter, but it was still unclear just who she really was. One of the trainees, who had been quiet until now, took a step closer to Haley's lane. His eyes, trained for detail, caught sight of something on her arm. It was subtle, partially obscured by the sleeve of her shirt, but there was no mistaking it a tattoo. An eagle wrapped around a serpent, the symbol of one of the most secretive special forces units in the world. His breath caught in his throat. The tattoo was unmistakable. It was the calling card of the Ghost Talon operatives, a group so classified that most military personnel didn't even know they existed. He took a sharp step back, his pulse quickening, as the weight of the realization settled in. The tattoo wasn't just a symbol. It was a marker of a legend, and he had been mocking that legend just moments ago. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Another trainee, having caught sight of the same tattoo, exchanged a glance with him. The laughter that had filled the air just moments before started to fade, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. They still didn't know who she was, but the fear that something big was at play began to creep in. The air around the shooting range seemed to grow heavier, as if the gravity of the moment was slowly dawning on everyone. Haley remained unfazed, her focus solely on the target in front of her, unaware of the ripple of recognition that had just begun to spread through the group. Then, as if summoned by the change in atmosphere, Commander Ryan Cole entered the range. He wasn't here for a routine check. He had felt the shift, sensed that something was out of the ordinary. He'd been briefed on the situation, but hadn't expected to find anything remarkable in this civilian range. But when his eyes landed on Haley, everything clicked into place. It was the tattoo, of course, but it was also the shooting technique, the way she handled her rifle, the smooth transitions between shots, the precision with which each round struck the target. It was unmistakable. She was no civilian. Haley Brooks wasn't just any marksman. She was a Ghost Talon operative, a living legend. Commander Cole's face drained of color as the realization hit him like a wave. He had never expected to see someone like her in a setting like this. Not in public. Not where anyone could stumble across her. The range, which had been filled with casual noise moments ago, now fell into a dead silence. The sudden quiet was oppressive, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. Haley, still focused on her rifle, didn't notice the shift. The SEAL trainees, now completely aware of her true identity, looked at each other, their faces flushed with shock and embarrassment. They had mocked her, underestimated her, and now the weight of that mistake hit them all at once. They were standing in the presence of someone who had operated in the shadows, someone whose skills were beyond anything they could imagine. Cole's voice cut through the silence. It was low, respectful, and filled with an authority that only someone of his stature could command. "Where did you serve, Ghost Talon?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Haley's profile. The question wasn't just a formality, it was a recognition, an acknowledgement of her status within the military. The trainees around him stood frozen, still processing what was happening. They were no longer laughing. They were no longer confident in their assumptions. What they had witnessed, what they were witnessing, was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Haley's gaze never wavered from the target in front of her. She took a deep breath, her finger gently squeezing the trigger again. The shot rang out, cutting through the thick tension in the air. Her technique, flawless as ever, was the last confirmation any of them needed. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. She was an elite marksman, trained in the most hostile environments, and the lives of countless others had depended on her skills. She had come to this range to practice, to stay sharp, but the truth of who she was couldn't remain hidden any longer. Commander Cole took a step forward, his expression shifting from disbelief to deep respect. The entire range seemed to watch him, every set of eyes trained on the exchange between the legendary operative and the commander who had recognized her for what she truly was. Cole's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years spent in special operations. "You're not just a shooter," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "You're one of the best." The words hung in the air like a heavy statement of truth. The trainees, still processing the shock, slowly turned their eyes to Haley, who remained calm, unfazed by the attention. They could feel the shift in the air, the subtle hum of awe and reverence that had replaced the casual mockery they had directed at her moments ago. They were no longer in the presence of someone they could dismiss. Haley had shown them exactly who she was without saying a single word. She had proven herself in a way that left no room for doubt. Cole, now fully aware of the magnitude of the situation, turned to address the gathered trainees. His voice was clear, cutting through the silence. "What you've just seen," he began, his tone firm, "is not just exceptional marksmanship. It's a skill developed under pressure, honed in environments where missing wasn't an option. This is the kind of precision that makes missions succeed, the kind of skill that saves lives. It's a level of excellence most of you will never reach, but it's the standard you should aspire to." The trainees stood there, their faces a mixture of awe, guilt, and respect. They had underestimated Haley in the worst way possible. They had laughed at her, mocked her for being just another shooter. Now, they understood the error of their assumptions. The quiet woman who had seemed so out of place was not just any marksman. She was a living legend, one whose identity had remained hidden in the shadows until now. The range, which had once been filled with the sounds of mockery and laughter, now sat in stunned silence. The magnitude of Haley's identity had shifted the dynamic in a way no one could have predicted. As Cole's words settled in, the trainees began to understand the true value of what they had just witnessed. Haley Brooks wasn't just someone to be admired. She was someone who had lived a life of unimaginable risk, someone whose quiet demeanor hid a well of untold stories. And now, in this moment, those stories had come to light. The air in the shooting range had changed. The casual atmosphere, once filled with the easy banter of young men showing off and making jokes, had dissolved into a thick silence. Commander Ryan Cole stood near the entrance, his sharp eyes fixed on Haley. He had recognized her not just by the tattoo, but by the calm confidence with which she handled the rifle. The flawless technique that was so precise it could only belong to someone with a history far beyond the walls of this civilian range. He knew, without question, who she was. Cole took a step forward, his demeanor shifting from the casual ease of a commander to the respectful stance of someone addressing a legend. He walked toward Haley, his eyes not leaving her as she stood silently, preparing for her next shot. The trainees, who had just moments ago been mocking her, now watched in stunned silence, the full gravity of the situation settling in. Cole approached Haley and stopped just a few paces away. His voice was calm but carried the weight of years in special operations. "Ghost Talon," he said, his words carrying a reverence that made the room feel smaller, quieter. The name wasn't just a title, it was a symbol of excellence, of covert operations that few even knew existed, a name that, when spoken, demanded respect, and one that few ever heard unless they were part of that world. Haley didn't react. She didn't flinch or show surprise. She simply lowered her rifle slightly, acknowledging his presence without a word. The SEAL trainees and shooters around the range now felt an uncomfortable shift in the air. The same people who had ridiculed Haley moments ago were now standing in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. Commander Cole's simple address of Ghost Talon had transformed the atmosphere in the room. The realization began to wash over them, a wave of understanding that they were not in the presence of just another shooter. They were standing in front of someone whose skills were the stuff of legends, someone whose expertise could change the outcome of a mission with a single shot. Cole paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the group. He could see the confusion and awe in the faces of the trainees, their smug expressions now replaced with a deep respect they hadn't shown. Earlier, the shock of the moment hung in the air, palpable, as the magnitude of who Haley truly was started to sink in. "I know who you are," Cole continued, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet awe. "You are not just a marksman. You are one of the best we have. You're one of the Ghost Talon operatives who make impossible missions possible." His words resonated with the kind of truth that only someone with first-hand experience in the special operations community could convey. He wasn't just recognizing Haley's talent as a shooter, he was acknowledging her status in a world where every shot counts, and the stakes are often life and death. The trainees exchanged looks, their realization dawning with the weight of what they had just learned. They had mocked her, dismissed her, laughed at her, and now they stood face to face with the very person who had proven that such arrogance was not just misplaced but dangerous. Haley Brooks wasn't a civilian playing at shooting. She was an operative whose name carried weight, whose actions had saved countless lives without the need for recognition. As the moment stretched on, Cole stepped forward and offered a salute, the kind reserved only for those whose contributions were so significant, so impactful, that no words could truly express the respect they deserved. Haley remained calm, not returning the salute immediately, but acknowledging the gesture with a small, subtle nod. It was a quiet recognition, the type that came from someone who understood the importance of discretion, of remaining unseen despite the enormous weight of their accomplishments. Around the room, the other shooters and trainees slowly began to grasp the full extent of Haley's identity. The young SEAL who had mocked her earlier looked like he had been struck, speechless. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood frozen, his earlier arrogance replaced by a deep sense of shame. The others, who had been so quick to judge, now watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had laughed at her, underestimated her, and now they were seeing the true meaning of precision and expertise, a level of skill that few ever achieve, and fewer still are able to perform under the kind of pressure Haley had endured. Cole, still standing at attention, looked at the group, his voice carrying across the range. "What you've just witnessed," he said, "is not just exceptional marksmanship. It is a demonstration of operational excellence, of the kind of skill that ensures missions succeed where failure is not an option." His gaze moved from the trainees to Haley, as if to underscore the significance of his words. This isn't something that's taught in a classroom. It's earned in the field, under the most intense conditions imaginable. The SEAL trainees, their faces now flushed with understanding, snapped to attention. For the first time, they weren't standing before just another civilian. They were standing before someone whose contributions were so critical, so profound, that they would never fully comprehend the weight of her experience. But they would respect it, and that respect would shape their actions moving forward. Cole turned to Haley and offered a final nod of acknowledgement, his eyes conveying a level of understanding and respect that only someone who had worked alongside legendary operatives could truly express. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "it has been an honor to witness your skill today." His voice softened, the reverence in his tone clear. "The world may not know your name, but those of us in the field understand the significance of your contributions. We owe you more than words can express." The silence that followed was thick, full of reverence and awe. The once casual and light-hearted environment had transformed into something more serious, something more meaningful. The SEAL trainees, who had once looked at Haley with disdain, now looked at her with something else: respect, admiration, and perhaps even a bit of envy. They had just witnessed firsthand the truth that skill speaks louder than any words ever could. As Haley stood there, the weight of the moment finally settling in, she didn't ask for acknowledgement or recognition. She simply accepted it in the quiet way she always did, with grace, with humility, and with the knowledge that she had proven her worth without ever needing to say a word. The trainees and the shooters around her, though, would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. The moment when they had learned that true excellence doesn't need to be announced. It speaks for itself. And as the range returned to its normal rhythm, the trainees who had once dismissed her now understood the true meaning of precision and excellence. They had witnessed a quiet hero, someone who had proven that the most powerful things often come in the most understated forms. The shift in their perception was complete. And for Haley, that was enough. She hadn't needed to prove anything to them. Her actions had done that for her. The shift in the atmosphere at the range was unmistakable. The young SEAL trainees, who had once laughed and ridiculed Haley, now stood in stunned silence, processing the events that had just unfolded. Their confidence had been shattered by the quiet woman they had underestimated. The realization that they had been wrong, not just about her abilities, but about the entire nature of precision shooting, slowly began to dawn on them. This wasn't just about hitting a target. This was about mastering a craft that could only be honed through years of discipline, experience, and life-and-death situations. Commander Cole, having observed the trainees' reactions, understood that it was time to impart a crucial lesson. He looked at the young man who had mocked Haley earlier, the one who had so confidently advised her to start with easier targets. Cole's eyes narrowed, his gaze steady. The trainee, now realizing the enormity of his mistake, shifted uncomfortably under the commander's stare. Cole stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You," he said, pointing directly at the young SEAL who had mocked Haley. "You just got a lesson today, but it wasn't from me." His words were direct, but there was no malice. It was a simple, undeniable truth. The trainee's face flushed with embarrassment. The quiet hero he had mocked was now standing in front of him, and he had no words to offer. "You thought Haley was just another recreational shooter, didn't you?" Cole continued, his tone taking on a more instructive quality. "You thought her skill was based on a few weekend practices, but that's not the reality of what you saw here today." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, then continued. "What you witnessed wasn't just good marksmanship. It was operational, precision, and that's a whole different level." The trainees stood still, their earlier cocky demeanor now replaced with a quiet humility. They were beginning to understand the difference between shooting for fun and shooting for survival. Cole, noticing the shift, began to elaborate. "Basic marksmanship is about hitting a target, but operational precision," he said, "is about hitting that target when it counts, under pressure, and in environments where missing means failure. It's about maintaining calm, focus, and control in situations where most people would crack." He walked slowly in front of the group, his eyes scanning each of them. What Haley just showed you," he continued, "wasn't about what's easy. It wasn't about showing off. It was about precision under pressure, under real-world conditions, where every shot matters. That's what separates the good from the great. That's what makes someone a true professional." As the words settled, the trainees began to process the weight of the lesson. They thought they understood what it meant to be a good shot, to be elite. They had spent countless hours at the range, perfected their own skills, and had no doubt in their ability to perform in almost any situation. But Haley's display had opened their eyes to something far deeper. They hadn't just seen the technical precision of a well-trained marksman. They had seen the mindset, the calm and collected presence of someone who had been through operations, where the stakes were life or death. Cole turned his attention back to the young trainee who had mocked Haley. "You thought you could teach her, didn't you? You thought you knew better." Cole said, his voice now tinged with a touch of disappointment. But you didn't. Haley wasn't there to impress anyone. She didn't need your advice, because she's been in situations where your typical advice wouldn't have mattered." He paused, letting that thought land. "In the field, we don't have the luxury of second-guessing our skills. We have to rely on what we've mastered, on the skills we've perfected under fire." The young trainee swallowed hard, his previous bravado replaced by a profound sense of humility. He had no defense, no words to counter Cole's lesson. His earlier actions, so full of cocky superiority, now seemed laughable. He had underestimated Haley, and now the full weight of that mistake hit him. Cole's voice softened slightly as he turned to address the entire group. "This is a lesson in respect. Respect for those who have mastered their craft. Respect for those who do the work in the shadows, often unseen, and without the recognition they deserve. Most of you wouldn't even know who Haley was if you hadn't witnessed her shooting today. But her skills have saved lives, more lives than you can count, and they've made impossible missions possible." The trainees looked around at each other, the sense of their own limitations settling in. For the first time, they began to grasp the true meaning of excellence in their field. It wasn't about flashy gear or fast talk. It was about deep, quiet competence. It was about being so good at what you do that others don't even know they've been outclassed until the results speak for themselves. As Cole continued to speak, his words became less about pointing out mistakes and more about teaching the importance of learning from them. You all have potential. You wouldn't be here in this program if you didn't, but potential isn't enough. You need to put in the time, the discipline, the mental toughness to become more than just a good shot. You need to become someone whose presence alone can change the course of an operation. The young trainees, still processing everything, now stood taller, their posture straighter as they took in the significance of Cole's words. They were learning a deeper lesson, one that went beyond their own pride and into the core of what it meant to be a professional, a true operator. It wasn't about public recognition or showing off. It was about knowing that when the time came, their skill would speak for itself loud enough to leave an impression that no one could ignore. Remember this moment, Cole concluded, his voice strong and clear. What Haley showed you today was not just about shooting. It was about making sure that when lives are on the line, your skill will always be ready, no matter what. And that's something that has to be earned. The range fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of mockery or confusion. It was the respectful silence of understanding. Haley had, without ever trying, shown them what real precision looked like. And in doing so, she had taught them a lesson they would never forget. The trainees walked away that day, not just with a deeper understanding of shooting, but with a newfound respect for the quiet professionals who work behind the scenes, ensuring that operations succeed when everything is on the line. And Haley, in her silent way, had taught them the most valuable lesson of all, that true skill doesn't need to be announced. It speaks for itself. As the day wore on, Haley continued to practice with the same quiet focus she had displayed from the beginning. The shooting range, which had once been filled with laughter and mockery, had now settled into a deeper silence. The other shooters, including the young SEAL trainees, had returned to their own lanes, but something had shifted. The casual conversations that once filled the air had turned into introspective silence, as they all reflected on the lesson they had just learned. Haley, however, remained unaware of the transformation she had caused in the room. She wasn't looking for recognition. She wasn't looking for anything at all, except to stay sharp, to stay true to the skills she had honed over the years. The trainees, now fully aware of the depth of their mistake, approached their own practice with newfound respect. They no longer spoke to each other with the same arrogance that had defined their interactions earlier. There was a shift in the way they carried themselves, as if they were seeing the range and their training in a different light. They had learned something invaluable that day, not just about shooting, but about humility and the quiet power of true skill. They realized that, in their eagerness to prove themselves, they had overlooked the most important thing, the unspoken knowledge that true expertise often comes without the need for attention or fanfare. As the sun began to set and the range slowly emptied, the weight of the day's events lingered in the air. The trainees packed up their gear in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They knew they had been taught a lesson that they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. They had been reminded that skill isn't about being the loudest or the most obvious. It's about being the most capable, the most consistent, and the most ready when it matters most. They had seen the kind of precision that could make or break a mission, and they now understood the importance of always respecting others, especially those who don't need to boast about their abilities. Haley's silhouette remained at the far end of the range, her figure almost blending into the shadows. The other shooters, who had once seen her as just another civilian, now understood the weight of what she had accomplished. They had witnessed firsthand the power of quiet excellence, the kind of power that doesn't need to be declared, but simply exists in the calm confidence of someone who has mastered their craft. It was a reminder that some of the most important work is done without recognition, without applause, and without the desire for praise. As the trainees left the range, many of them glanced back at Haley. They didn't approach her, nor did they speak to her. They understood that she wasn't there to be acknowledged. She wasn't interested in their admiration. She had simply shown them the meaning of excellence, the kind of excellence that exists without the need to flaunt it. And that lesson was far more powerful than anything they could have imagined. Cole, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, walked past Haley on his way out. He gave her a respectful nod, acknowledging what had been done that day. Haley didn't respond, but the subtle shift in her posture told him everything he needed to know. She had done her job, and now she would move on, just as she always did. There was no need for fanfare. There was no need for a hero's welcome. She knew her worth, and that was enough. As the last few shooters gathered their things and made their way to the exit, the range began to empty. The noise of the day faded into the background, leaving behind only the soft hum of the world outside. Haley remained where she was, the quiet echo of her precision still hanging in the air. She wasn't looking for validation, but in the silence that surrounded her, she had earned something far more valuable, the respect of those who had once doubted her. The trainees, now fully aware of what had just transpired, left the range with their heads held a little higher. Their respect for those who serve in the shadows deepened. They understood now that excellence doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to be flashy or loud. The true measure of skill is in its quiet power, in the ability to perform when it matters most, and to do so without the need for recognition. The lesson of the day was clear. Those who truly excel often do so in the silence of their own competence. They don't seek applause or acknowledgement. They simply do their job, quietly and efficiently, knowing that the true value of their work is in the impact it has, not the attention it receives. As the trainees walked away, they understood this truth more deeply than ever before. They had learned that respect is earned not through words, but through action, through the quiet, consistent demonstration of skill, precision, and humility. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty range, the legend of Haley Brooks remained untold to most. But for those who had witnessed her skill firsthand, her legacy had already been cemented. She was a silent hero, one whose marksmanship spoke louder than any words ever could.